There we go. We get our friend in the right place here. So, I have a question for you this morning. Did I wake you up? I'm so sorry. I have a question for you this morning. It's rhetorical, of course. Is this heaven or hell? That's not an idle question. Because you know, don't you, that the world ended on May 21st, 2011. At least that is what the Reverend Harold Camping prophesied would happen. He broadcasted that message around the whole world. He said the rapture was coming. He set up billboards, expensive billboards in Israel and Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq. And in Vietnam, he's caused such a ruckus that the government had to try to disperse an unruly crowd of over 5,000 of his followers. Thousands of others around the world held going-away parties. They were going to heaven. And it didn't matter to them at all that he had already made a similar prediction about the apocalypse coming back in 1994. But wait. May 21 passed, and well, nothing much happened, now did it? And so he said he miscalculated. And so he recalculated, and he came up with a new real date for the end of the world, and he said it was going to be October 21st, 2011. Did you miss it? Well, I did too. Superstitions, they are everywhere. Lucky charms, unlucky numbers, things not to do, like stepping on a crack and breaking your mother's back. Things to do, like knocking on wood. Enchanted forest, haunted houses, well, the list goes on and on. Now, given that fact, I thought that it might do us well this morning to raise the question, why is it that some people believe in what other people consider to be weird things? Let's begin with an historic example. In the year 1504, Christopher Columbus, you may have heard of him, he and his crew were anchored off of the coast of Jamaica. Their supplies, however, were running low, but the Jamaican Indians were there. However, they refused to sell them anything. Now, it was smart of Columbus to notice something in his almanac that proved helpful. He noticed that there was about to be a lunar eclipse. And so on the day predicted, he called on the Jamaicans, and he told them that he would blot out the moon unless they sold him some food. Well, they laughed, of course. But then that night, guess what happened? The eclipse came and the moon began to be dark. And they ran to him in great terror. And he told them, all is fine. I will restore the moon if you will simply bring us some food. And they did that almost immediately, and he agreed and did what he said, and the moon reappeared ever so nicely. And the Jamaicans after that then hurried to supply Columbus all of the things that he needed. Now, superstition, it has been said by Edmund Berg, is the religion of feeble minds. It arises, he said, from uneducated ignorance, from unmitigated stupidity, and from unreasonable emotionalism. And in every case, he pointed out the lives of such true believers are diminished in quality, while the lives of those around them are inconvenienced and sometimes in danger. Now, eclipses illustrate not only the problem of superstition, they also illustrate the cure. The first philosopher you may have heard of was Thales. He was a very brilliant individual. On a trip to Egypt, he devised a way to measure the height of the pyramids measuring their shadows at the same time of day, that a person's shadow was equal to his height. Simple. Back home in Miletus, he constructed an instrument for measuring the distance that ships are and could be sighted at sea. He did many, many fascinating things, but the one act that distinguished him as the first philosopher in the West occurred when he did what priests and prophets had been doing for centuries. He predicted a solar eclipse. Now, what made his prediction very different was that instead of praying or consulting magical bones or receiving any kind of revelation, Thales based his claim upon an empirical analysis of the sky. And sure enough, on May 25, 585 BCE, just as he had predicted, the light of the sun went out, and the light of philosophy went on. Now, in his book, Magic, Science, and Religion, Breslau Malinowski wrote the following: "Science," he said, "is founded upon the conviction that experience, effort, and reason are valid. Magic," he said, "is founded upon the belief that hope cannot fail, nor desire deceive." Skepticism is the first step on the road to philosophy and also to science. But skepticism is often misunderstood, and sometimes it even gets a bad name. Back in the early 1800s, for example, and we had up here a little earlier a picture that illustrates this. Back in the early 1800s, true story, a farmer and his wife went to a circus for the first time in their lives, and they stood amazed in front of the dromedary's cage. And they examined that beast in every detail, from its misshapen legs to its cloven hooves, to the sleepy eyes and, well, the mounded hump in the middle. They looked and they looked and they looked at that tired old camel, and finally the skeptical farmer turned away from his wife with disgust, and he said to her, "Hell, there ain't no such animal." Well, such closed-minded rejection of obvious facts is not what philosophical and scientific skepticism is really about. Nevertheless, some people think that it is. In an essay entitled "The Power of Positive Skepticism," the great evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould addressed this whole problem. He said, "Skepticism, or debunking as it may be called, often receives the bad rap reserved for activities like garbage disposal, which absolutely must be done for a safe and sane life, but which seem either unglamorous or unworthy of our overt celebration." Echoing Voltaire, who said, "As long as people believe in absurdities, they will continue to commit atrocities." Gould wrote, "Only two possible escapes can save us from the organized mayhem that has given us crusades and witch hunts and enslavements and holocausts. Moral decency," he said, "provides one necessary ingredient, but not nearly enough. The second foundation," he said, "must come from the rational side of our mentality. For unless we rigorously use human reason both to discover and to acknowledge nature's factuality, and to follow the logical implications thereof, then we will lose out to the frightening forces of irrationality, romanticism, uncompromising true belief, and the resulting inevitability of mob action." Now, skepticism, said Gould, is the agent of reason against organized irrationalism, and is therefore one of the keys to human social and civic decency. Despite massive opposition, the force of reason has won great victories, thank goodness, from Supreme Court decisions against creationism, for example, down to local debunkings of phony psychics and faith healers. The most potent weapons in this battle have been double-blind experimentation and statistical analysis. Almost every modern irrationalism can be defeated by these scientific tools, says Gould. Now, Gould ended his essay by rejecting the misconception that skepticism is a nihilistic exercise. Instead, he declared proper debunking, when tied to moral decency, constitute the most powerful joint instrument for good that our planet has ever known. Now, I cite Stephen Jay Gould this morning for two reasons. First of all, because he was one of our greatest scientists and humanists. And second, because his essay appears as the foreword of a book that I think all of us should read. It is entitled, Why People Believe Weird Things, with the subtitle, Pseudoscience, Superstition, and Other Confusions of Our Time. It is a book written by Michael Shermer, who has wonderful credentials. Let me list a few of them as time permits. He is, for example, publisher of Skeptic Magazine, director of the Skeptic Society, the host of the Skeptics Lecture Series at the California Institute of Technology. He is professor of the history of science, technology, and evolutionary thought at Occidental College in Los Angeles, and a few other things. Now, Shermer's book is about the distinction between science and pseudoscience, between history and pseudo-history, and the difference that distinction makes. He covers such topics as psychic power and extrasensory perception, UFOs and alien abductions, ghosts and haunted houses, creation, science, and biblical literalism, the Holocaust and Holocaust denial, race and IQ issues, political extremism, the radical right, Satanism, and a whole lot more. It's not a boring book. In fact, what it is, this book is a celebration of the scientific spirit and of the importance of skepticism. Now, like Gould, Shermer knows that some people confuse skeptic with cynic. And they think that skeptics are a bunch of grumpy curmudgeons, unwilling to accept any claim that challenges the status quo. This, he says, is wrong. For skepticism is a method. When properly done, it is not a position. Ideally, he says, skeptics do not go into any investigation closed to the possibility that a phenomenon might be real, or that a claim might be true. Rather, they draw their conclusions from whatever evidence emerges. Now this morning I want to tell you what Shermer says in his last chapter, Why Do People Believe Weird Things? Shermer begins by talking about firewalking. In 1996, he went on PBS television on the show Bill Nye, the Science Guy. This was, as you may recall, an educational program for children, and it was great fun. Now, to debunk pseudoscience and the paranormal, Shermer and Bill Nye walked barefoot across a 6-foot-long bed of red-hot coals, which registered around 800 degrees Fahrenheit. No trickery was involved, and both of them remained totally unscathed. Now, how in the world could that be? Well, as Shermer explains, the answer is quite simple scientifically. He says, when you bake a cake in an oven, the air and the cake and the metal, the pan, they are all at 400 degrees. But only the pan will burn your skin. Hot coals, he says, are very much like the cake. They do not conduct heat quickly. And so, as long as anyone walks across the burning coals rapidly, no harm will be done. Now, Shermer uses firewalking to raise the question, what constitutes a weird thing? And he says the following, I have no formal definition. Weird things are like pornography, They are difficult to define, but obvious when you see them. One person's weird thing might be another's cherished belief. That's a very UU principle. By the way, that's principle number one. Let me repeat it. One person's weird thing might be another person's cherished belief. Well, as far as Shermer is concerned, he asks the question, who's to say? And he replies, well, sometimes scientists are to say. And to clarify that, he tells us a story about Tony Robbins. You may recall Tony Robbins. I see that's all I had to do, wasn't it, to remind you of this self-help guru. He got his start in the early 1980s by holding weekend seminars climaxing in a firewalk. Robbins told his audiences that if they wanted to be able to walk on the hot coals unscathed, all they had to do was practice mind over matter. And they could do it. And they did. Now, Shermer says, can Tony Robbins really and all his people walk barefoot over hot coals without burning themselves? And the answer is, sure they can. And then he says, so can I, and so can you. But you and I can do it without meditating, without chanting, without praying, without paying hundreds of dollars for any seminar. Because scientists have shown us how. Firewalking, Shermer says, has nothing to do with mental power. Now, belief that it does, according to Shermer, is what he would call a weird thing. There are a lot of weird things that some people believe in, and he has his own little list, which includes the following: alien abductions, creationism, crystal power, ESP, faith healing, ghosts, life after death, the Loch Ness monster, near-death experiences, past lives, pyramid power, psychics, reincarnation, Sasquatch or Bigfoot, UFO alien visitors, voodoo, and on and on. Now, this all raises a question that begs to be answered, and it is, what is going on in our culture and in our thinking that leads people to hold such weird beliefs? Well, he says many explanations have been offered. And they would include no education, miseducation, lack of critical thinking, rise of religion, decline of religion, displacement of traditional religion by cults, fear of science, the New Age, the Dark Ages revisited, not enough reading, reading the wrong books, poor parenting, lousy teachers, plain old ignorance and stupidity, and on and on. Now, Shermer argues there is not a single answer. But he does say there can be discerned 5 underlying motivations. And what I want to do now is tell you what they are. First, according to Shermer, is what he calls credo consolans in Latin. He says people believe weird things because they want to, because it makes them feel good. And he cites a Gallup poll which shows that 96% of Americans believe in God, some God. 90% believe in heaven. 79% believe in miracles. 72% believe in angels, and on and on. The fact, he says, that such beliefs contradict logic and have insufficient empirical evidence to convince either scientists or courts of law is not as important to these people as the comfort they get from believing. Now, he points out that even skeptics and scientists are not immune from this comfort desire. And he has, as an example, somebody you may have heard of, probably have read several of his books, Martin Gardner. Martin Gardner is a skeptical, he's deceased, a skeptical scientist. But in an interview, he confessed also to being a fideist, a believer in some kind of a God. Gardner wrote the following. He said, "Fideism refers to believing something on the basis of faith or emotional reasons rather than intellectual reasons. I," said Gardner, "don't think there are any arguments that prove the existence of God or of immortality. More than that," he said, "I think the better arguments are on the other side, the side of the atheists." So, he concluded, my own case of theism is really a quixotic, emotional belief that goes against all the evidence. Now, Mark Twain, one of my saints, summarized this particular approach. That would be St. Mark to you, a biblical notion. Mark Twain said, "Faith is believing what you know ain't so." Nevertheless, most people do in fact believe in some weird things, and they do so because they want to, and they want to because it makes them feel good. And as long ago as 348 BCE, Demosthenes knew all of this because he wrote, quote, "Nothing is so easy as to deceive oneself, for what we wish, that we readily believe." So that's number one. The second motivation cited by Shermer is immediate gratification. Most weird beliefs provide immediate, sometimes instant, satisfaction, whereas the knowledge that a person can get from science and or from philosophy usually takes a very long time to acquire and then to understand. Shermer, for an example, compares psychic telephone hotlines to psychotherapy. Now, in both cases, he says, people tend to seek out help for their problems. Problems that involve love, or health, or money, or their career. The psychic's job, on the one hand, is to keep the caller on the line for as long as possible at about $3.95 and up per minute. Using mind-reading techniques that are straight out of vaudeville acts and circus aside shows, the psychic then says ambiguous things like, "I sense there is tension in your relationship," or "You've been thinking about changing careers." Now, since these trite statements are true for most people, the caller usually is impressed very quickly. Now, if one or the other of such comments fails, the psychic tries another and another until he hits pay dirt. As Shermer says, skeptics don't spend $3.95 a minute on psychic hotlines. Believers do. And they call, he says, mostly at night and on weekends because, well, they're lonely and they need someone to talk to. The soft, soothing, sympathetic sophistry of the psychic is quick. Better than that, it's cheap. Sort of the poor man's counsel. Now, in contrast to all of that, consider psychotherapy. It is very formal. It is very expensive. And it is very time-consuming. Insight, deep insight, and improvement may be possible, but if they occur at all, they take months or years. And the delay of gratification is the norm. So that's number two. Number three on Shermer's list is simplicity. We all like simplicity. Weird beliefs usually offer simplistic explanations for what really require complex and difficult answers. Shermer says, good and bad things happen to both good and bad people. Scientific explanations are often complicated and require training and effort to work through, whereas superstition and belief in fate or the supernatural can provide a simpler path through life's complex maze. Now, to show that some people will accept any explanation, and I dare you to try this one at home. Some people will accept any explanation as long as it's simpler than other explanations, Shermer reports upon a prank that was pulled by Harry Edwards, who at that time was head of the Australian Skeptics Society. Edwards published a letter in his local newspaper. And in that letter, he claimed that he had discovered a correlation between various lucky events in his life and his pet chicken's droppings. He ended the letter by offering to sell his, quote, lucky chicken crap to interested readers. And lo and behold, the orders started coming in. Number 4. Morality and meaning, or, says Shermer, a fourth, motivation for believing in weird things. Scientific and secular systems of morality and meaning have proved relatively unsatisfying for most people. And I personally can testify to that because I have for years taught ethics and philosophy. And I know firsthand from my students that most people simply do not want to take the time to do the work that is required to learn and to understand the systems of the great philosophers and ethicists. And yet, without doing such intellectual digging, they never find the buried treasures, and so they go away dissatisfied. Shermer says, people ask, without belief in some higher power, well, why be moral at all? That same foolish question was often asked of early universalists because they rejected the doctrine of eternal damnation. Now, one man came up to our American Universalist father, John Murray, and asked him, if there's no hell, then what's to stop me from going out and robbing and raping and murdering? To which Murray challenged him right back by asking, well, whether or not there is a hell, why, sir, would you want to do such things? To which he got no answer. Scientists and humanists have good answers, however, to questions about morality and about the meaning of life, says Shermer. But to most people, science seems to offer only cold and brutal logic in its presentation of an infinite, uncaring, purposeless universe. Such an outlook they find to be too frightening, and so they turn instead for the comforting consolation of pseudoscience, superstition, myth, magic, and traditional religion. Number 5, then, finally, Shermer describes as the fifth motivation. Well, he uses a phrase to encapsulate it. He says, hope springs eternal. Now, I grew up in Texas, and we kind of cut to the chase. In our local lingo, my phrase is a little different. It is grasping at straws. Human life is often frightening and dangerous and deadly. Disease and disaster and death are inescapable, and so human anxiety abounds. Now, in spite of that, humans are, by nature, a rather forward-looking species, always seeking greater levels of happiness and of satisfaction. Unfortunately, writes Shermer, the corollary is that humans are all too often willing to grasp at unrealistic promises of a better life. Edward Gibbon, in his famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, knew that. He wrote this, "Skepticism," he said, "may amuse a few inquisitive minds, but superstition is so congenial to the multitude that if they are forcibly awakened, they still regret the loss of their pleasing visions." Such a pronouncement makes the beautiful wish of Baruch Spinoza all the less likely of ever coming true. He wrote in 1670, "How blessed would be our age if it could witness a religion free from all the trammels of superstition." Well, nevertheless, there is one religion, Unitarian-Universalism, which comes close to his desire. For we are guided not only by Moses and by Jesus, but also by Darwin and by Freud. Indeed, our sources of inspiration include all of the world's major